What if some of the clearest signs of unusually high intelligence have nothing to do with grades, degrees, or how quickly someone can answer a question? Psychology points to several cognitive patterns that tend to appear more often at the higher end of intellectual ability, and some of them are surprisingly subtle. They don't show up on a resume, and most of the people who have them have never once thought of themselves as gifted. They just assumed everyone's mind worked this way. One thing before we start, high IQ doesn't automatically make someone emotionally mature, successful, or different in some romantic sense. Cognitive ability is one narrow slice of a person, not a personality type. But certain cognitive patterns do show up more consistently in people with very high intellectual ability, and researchers have spent decades trying to name them precisely. Here are 8 of them. Worth saying too, none of these are pass-fail. You won't recognize all 8, and that's normal. Most people see themselves clearly in 2 or 3, partially in a few more, and not at all in the rest. That's not a problem with the list. It's just how cognitive traits actually distribute across real people, instead of the neat all-or-nothing package a title like this one might imply. Picture 2 people looking at the same unsolved problem. One wants an answer by the end of the meeting, the other is still turning it over 3 days later, not because they're stuck, but because they're not in a hurry to be done with it. Psychologists call the drive to reach a fast, definite answer the need for cognitive closure. For many people, ambiguity is uncomfortable, so the mind reaches for the nearest workable answer and moves on. It's not laziness, it's a genuine discomfort with the open-ended. Research by psychologist Ari Kruglanski, who developed this concept, suggests that people with a lower need for cognitive closure tend to show more abstract thinking, more intellectual flexibility, and stronger creative problem-solving. They can hold 2 competing explanations in mind at the same time without feeling an urgent need to pick one. In plain terms, they're not afraid of not knowing. They're genuinely curious about it. Ask them a question they can't answer, and instead of deflecting or guessing, they'll often say something like, "I don't know yet," and mean it as an invitation to keep thinking, not an admission of failure. This shows up outside the lab too. In group settings, this is often the person who doesn't jump in first with an opinion, not because they have nothing to say, but because they're still genuinely weighing it. They'll ask a second question before offering a first answer. And when a debate gets heated and everyone else is defending a fixed position, they're the one quietly asking what would actually change their mind. That single question, "What would change my mind here?" is one of the simplest tells of a mind that treats conclusions as provisional rather than final. Here's a question worth sitting with. When you look at a mess of information, a spreadsheet, an argument, a room full of people, do you see the details? Or do you see the shape underneath the details? Cognitive research consistently identifies pattern recognition, the ability to spot structure, relationships, and regularities that aren't explicitly stated as one of the more reliable markers of high fluid intelligence. This is one reason many fluid intelligence tests rely heavily on matrix and sequence-based reasoning. They're designed to assess the ability to detect relationships and rules, rather than simply recall learned information. People with strong pattern recognition often describe it as things clicking faster than they can explain why they notice the parallel between 2 unrelated situations before they can articulate what the parallel actually is. A market shift starts to look like a pattern they've seen before in a completely different system. A stranger's argument starts to sound like one they've already heard, just wearing different words. It's worth noting this isn't mysticism or intuition in some vague sense. It's the brain compressing a large amount of prior experience into a shortcut, and applying that shortcut faster than conscious reasoning can keep up. This is also why the same trait can look almost invisible from the outside. A strong pattern recognizer often can't fully explain their first instinct about a problem. The why arrives after the what. They'll say something feels off about a plan, or feels right about a decision, well before they can lay out the reasoning in words. Given time, they usually can reconstruct the logic, but the recognition itself happens faster than the explanation, which is part of why this trait so often gets mistaken for luck or gut feeling rather than what it actually is. compressed reasoning running underneath the surface. A colleague explains a new concept once. Most people ask a clarifying question. One person in the room is already relating it to something from an entirely different field, a biology metaphor for a business problem. A music theory idea applied to code architecture. This is sometimes called cross-domain transfer, recognizing that a principle learned in one context applies somewhere completely different. Studies on expertise and intelligence suggest that this ability is associated with stronger cognitive performance and more flexible learning. And it's a big part of why some people seem to learn new fields unusually quickly. They're not starting from zero, they're mapping new material onto structures they already understand. You can often spot this in the questions someone asks when they're learning something new. Instead of "how do I do this step," they ask, "what is this actually similar to?" Because once they find the right analogy, the rest of the material tends to fall into place on its own. There's a downside worth naming honestly. This habit can make explanations to other people harder, not easier. Someone who thinks in cross-domain analogies will sometimes explain a new idea by reaching for a comparison that makes perfect sense to them and lands as confusing to everyone else because the listener doesn't share the same mental library of unrelated fields to draw the connection from, which is why the skill of connecting distant ideas and the skill of communicating simply, covered a little later, are genuinely separate abilities. Having one doesn't guarantee the other. Some problems can't be solved one piece at a time. They require holding several moving parts in mind at once, a variable here, a constraint there, how one change ripples into the next without losing track of any of them. This is working memory, the mental workspace that lets you manipulate information rather than just store it. Cognitive research consistently links working memory capacity to measures of fluid intelligence. It's one of the better established relationships in the field, not just a correlation with focus or discipline. In practice, this looks like being able to keep a complex problem's moving parts in mind long enough to actually reason across them, rather than losing the thread and having to start over each time a new variable gets added. Think of someone rearranging a schedule with a dozen conflicting constraints entirely in their head, or debugging code by mentally tracing 5 variables through 3 different functions without writing anything down. The workspace doesn't overflow as quickly as it does for most people. It's also worth being precise about what this isn't. It isn't the same as having a good memory in the sense of recalling facts. Someone can have an average memory for names, dates, or trivia, and still have exceptional working memory for active manipulation. The difference is between storage and workspace. One is a filing cabinet, the other is a desk. What matters here is how much can sit open on the desk at once without anything sliding onto the floor. Give 2 people the same piece of hard criticism. One's first move, often before they've even finished hearing it, is to explain why it's wrong. The other's first move is to check whether it's true. This is intellectual humility, being willing to revise a belief when the evidence no longer supports it. Research on expert learners finds this trait is one of the more consistent differentiators between people who keep improving over time and people who plateau the willingness to let new information overwrite an existing comfortable conclusion. The important part isn't being right all the time. It's being willing to update your model when the evidence changes. It's a small, unglamorous habit in the moment, pausing before the rebuttal, asking what if they're right, before asking how do I respond. It shows up in quieter ways too, changing your mind in a conversation without needing to save face about it, or genuinely thanking someone for catching a mistake instead of getting defensive. But compounded over years, it's a large part of why some minds keep sharpening long after others have settled. None of this means feedback doesn't sting. It usually still does in the moment for anyone. The distinction isn't the absence of an emotional reaction, it's how quickly the emotional reaction gets separated from the evaluation of whether the feedback is actually correct. For most people, those 2 things arrive tangled together. Feeling criticized and being wrong feel like the same event. For someone with strong intellectual humility, they're two separate questions running in parallel: this stings, and is this true? And the second question gets answered on its own terms, not colored by the first. There's a trait researchers increasingly point to as a distinguishing feature of high cognitive performance, not raw processing speed, but metacognition, the ability to monitor your own reasoning while you're in the middle of it. It looks like this: mid-argument, part of the mind steps back and asks, wait, am I actually reasoning here, or am I just defending a position I already picked? It's the habit of catching your own blind spots in real time rather than only in hindsight. Metacognition doesn't mean never making mistakes. It means becoming better at noticing how you arrived at them. Someone with strong metacognition can often tell you, right after getting something wrong, exactly where their reasoning went off track, not because they're unusually self-critical, but because they were watching the process the whole time, almost like a second observer running alongside the first thought. Studies on expert problem solvers across chess, medicine, and mathematics repeatedly find this self-monitoring layer as a distinguishing feature between merely knowledgeable people and exceptionally capable ones. A chess master doesn't just calculate moves. Part of their mind is simultaneously evaluating whether the way they're calculating is even the right approach for this position. This is also one of the more trainable traits on this list, at least in part. Journaling through a decision after the fact, or narrating a thought process out loud while working through a hard problem, is essentially practicing metacognition on purpose. Over time, the internal narrator that asks, wait, why do I believe this, starts running automatically instead of needing to be switched on deliberately, which is part of why the trait tends to get stronger with certain kinds of deliberate practice, rather than being fixed from birth. Anyone can make a simple thing sound complicated. Very few people can take something genuinely complicated and explain it so clearly that it sounds obvious in hindsight. Physicist Richard Feynman was famous for this, his habit of explaining dense physics in language simple enough for a beginner to follow, which is where the popular Feynman technique for learning comes from. Separately from that anecdote, research on expertise supports the underlying idea. Deep understanding tends to correlate with the ability to compress an idea without losing what matters, not with the ability to make it sound impressive. Jargon, in a lot of cases, isn't a sign of expertise, it's a sign that the concept hasn't been fully digested yet. Once something is truly understood, it tends to get shorter to explain, not longer. This is a useful test to apply to yourself. Can you explain your hardest idea to a 12-year-old? If not, that's often a gap in understanding, not a gap in vocabulary. There's a second layer to this worth mentioning: knowing which details to cut. Simplifying badly means deleting things at random until an explanation sounds short, and usually losing something important in the process. Simplifying well means understanding a concept deeply enough to know exactly which details are load-bearing and which ones are decoration. Two explanations of the same idea can both be short, and only one of them is actually correct, because the other one simplified away the part that mattered. Most reasoning stays anchored to the specific case in front of it. A smaller number of people can strip a problem down to its underlying structure and reason about that structure directly, no concrete example required. This is close to the core of what IQ tests are actually built to measure. Tasks like Raven's progressive matrices deliberately remove language and cultural knowledge and test almost nothing but this: can you spot the abstract rule governing a sequence and apply it to a case you've never seen? Psychologists treat this kind of abstract reasoning and cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between frames, hold a rule in mind independent of its content, and apply it somewhere new, as one of the most direct markers of fluid intelligence. In everyday terms, it looks like taking a rule learned in one narrow situation, a negotiation tactic, a debugging habit, a piece of logic from a game, and applying it cleanly to a completely different kind of problem. It's also why some people can walk into an unfamiliar field with no prior training and still ask unusually sharp questions almost immediately. They're not relying on domain knowledge, they're applying structural reasoning that doesn't depend on the domain at all. The difference isn't simply knowing more. It's being able to recognize the underlying rule and carry that rule into a problem you've never seen before. Taken together, these 8 patterns aren't 8 unrelated tricks, they tend to reinforce each other. Comfort with ambiguity gives abstract reasoning room to operate instead of forcing a premature answer. Working memory gives pattern recognition enough space to actually connect what it's noticing. Metacognition and intellectual humility keep all of it honest, catching the moments where the mind is fooling itself. That's part of why these traits so often cluster together in the same people, not because any one of them causes the others, but because they form a kind of ecosystem that supports itself. If several of these patterns felt familiar, that may say something interesting about how your mind processes information, not necessarily how intelligent you are, but how you tend to think. And remember, none of these traits can diagnose your IQ. They're patterns associated with certain forms of cognitive performance, not a test score. Psychology can describe tendencies. It can't hand you a number from a video. If you're curious where you actually stand, a proper standardized assessment administered by a psychologist is the only reliable way to know. This list was never meant to substitute for that, only to make a few well-studied patterns easier to recognize in yourself and in the people around you. Which of these felt most like you? Comment the number below. And if you enjoy psychology that goes beneath the surface, subscribe to Turn Wiser.